Welcome to the Divine Identity Podcast, where we explore Scripture-first theology and the reality of God as revealed in the biblical text. In this explainer, we're looking at Igor's article, Genesis 1 and the Foundational Revelation of God. Now, the core idea here is absolutely crucial. Igor argues that Genesis 1 gives us the foundational revelation of God's nature. It reveals one God, not as a flat singularity, not as separate divine persons, and definitely not as temporary roles. Instead, it reveals one living God whose own spirit, personal center, and living concrete structure are entirely present right from the very beginning.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with what Genesis 1 actually reveals, look at how one subject has many functions, and explore God before created space. From there, we'll dive into distinction within belonging, unpack speech, sight, and structure, and wrap things up by looking at the human creaturely mirror. Let's jump right in.
Igor's article explains something really profound right out of the gate. Genesis 1 is the very first revelation of God as God. Think about it. It begins before creation is completely ordered and entirely before any later theological vocabulary even existed. Genesis 1 doesn't start with some complex metaphysical system. It just begins with God himself. And that matters because it offers us the first true grammar of God's nature. To firmly establish this foundation, the article walks through several specific textual anchors. Igor shows how the text builds on these core statements. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then, the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. From there, we repeatedly hear, "And God said," and God saw. We see God calling and naming things, God blessing, and finally, it all builds and culminates in that famous phrase, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness."
Section 1. What Genesis 1 reveals. Let's start with a really common problem in how we typically read the opening of Scripture.
A lot of the time, we just assume this chapter is a simple action log. Just a chronological checklist of what God did. But Igor argues that Genesis 1 does so much more than merely log events. It reveals exactly what kind of God is doing the creating. The article points out that God's nature doesn't need to wait around to be corrected or completed by later creeds or historical debates. The foundation is laid right here in the text itself.
Moving right along to Section 2, one subject, many functions.
Here is the guiding principle of Igor's entire framework. Genesis 1 keeps one subject, and that subject is God. The text never splits God into multiple agents or competing divine centers. The single subject securely anchors the unity of God. But, and this is key, the distinct functions like creating, hovering, speaking, and seeing reveal real, inseparable realities within that one God. So a single subject can be revealed through many functions without becoming many subjects. Make sense?
All right, Section 3, God before created space. Let's look at the very first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Genesis begins with God, not space. Igor shows that because the heavens and the earth are created by God, creation is clearly not a container for God. The universe isn't some cosmic room that God lives inside. Genesis gives creation a source, not God a location. God isn't located inside created space or some imagined eternal space. Rather, God is the living source from whom all of creation comes forth. Section 4. Distinction within belonging. This is where the grammar of the text gets really fascinating.
Let's look closely at Genesis 1:2. "And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." This is actually the first concrete distinction named in the chapter. Igor argues that this phrasing is no accident, and its placement right before any spoken commands carries massive foundational weight. Before God ever says, "Let there be light," the Spirit is already present and active.
The wording here is incredibly precise. Igor emphasizes that the word "of" preserves unity, while simultaneously identifying belonging, relation, and source. Notice, Genesis doesn't say "a spirit beside God." It says "the Spirit of God." This brilliantly identifies distinction within belonging. The Spirit belongs to God, yet the Spirit is named distinctly and has a specific function.
Igor's article explains that the word spirit isn't just a decorative term. It identifies a living, inward, non-material divine reality. And the fact that the Spirit is hovering tells us that this isn't some external detached force. This is God's own inward vitality and strength, present in active readiness over the waters.
That brings us to Section 5, speech, sight, and structure.
Whenever Genesis says, "And God said," it reveals the divine I, that personal center in God who wills and commands. Igor shows that these commands follow a very specific, ordered progression. On day 1, light is called forth. Day 2, realms are distinguished. Day 3, those realms are filled. This ordered progression reveals the divine I as the personal source point of intention, direction, and authority.
Now this leads us to a pretty profound question. The article points out that if God truly says and sees, meaning there is real divine expression and real divine perception going on, how does that actually happen? God isn't a creature, right? He doesn't have physical vocal cords or material retinas, and yet this language is clearly more than just an empty metaphor.
The answer Igor provides is divine structure. Igor's article explains this as God's ordered concreteness. We shouldn't think of this as a material anatomy or a spatial limitation, but rather as the uncreated, boundless, living reality by which God expresses commands, perceives his work, and ultimately is capable of being represented by an image.
We can really grasp this through Igor's analogy of a human craftsman. Think about it. When a craftsman builds something, his will determines the work, his strength empowers the work, and his hands express the work. The will isn't the hands, and the strength isn't the will, but they all belong to one person. It perfectly illustrates how distinguishable functions belong together in one living act, without dividing the person into multiple agents. Igor shows that Genesis 1 speaks of God using this exact same unified grammar. And finally, Section 6, the human creaturely mirror. Let's explore how the creation of mankind actually mirrors this distinction within unity. Right before man is made, God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." Igor argues that "let us make" reveals inward counsel within the gathered fullness of the one God. It's not a conversation between separate divine persons sitting around a table. It is the gathered movement of one unified being toward action.
Igor's article maps this out perfectly by looking at human aspects. In humans, the soul aspect functions as the personal I, or the will. The spirit aspect is our inward life reality, and the body aspect is our concrete structure. These are distinguishable dimensions within one unified human being. This logic of human distinction without separation directly reflects the divine parallel, showing exactly how one unified creator can have distinguishable realities: the divine I, the Spirit of God, and the divine structure.
Furthermore, when God creates man in his image and likeness, those specific words carry distinct weight. Igor shows that image points to God as the concrete original capable of representation. Meanwhile, likeness points to an inward personal correspondence, meaning man is made according to the God who genuinely possesses will, counsel, purpose, and structure.
Ultimately, Igor concludes that these distinctions in Genesis 1 aren't stages of development, they aren't separate parts of God, and they certainly aren't temporary roles. They are real, simultaneous, inseparable realities within the one God. This is the complete, foundational revelation of God's nature, standing as the permanent baseline for all theology that follows. Every later word in Scripture has to stand on this very foundation.
Genesis 1 doesn't merely say God did it. It gives us this beautiful, robust pattern of divine functions that reveal exactly who God is. So as Igor powerfully demonstrates, we are left with a critical question. Are you willing to let Genesis 1 define God first? Will your theology stand firmly on the biblical text itself, or will you rely on later systems to tell you what it means? Thank you for exploring this explainer with us today, and keep seeking the reality of God as revealed in the text.